5, 4, 3, 2.
Hi, GDR here with a little special on turning prose into poetry. A number of people have asked me about getting started as poets rather than just prose writing, which is what I've been focused on up till now. So looking at poetry itself and how you get started in it, one of the techniques you can use is to take prose and turn it into poetry. The fact is that embedded usually within all prose is a poetic element. There are elements in there that if you isolate them, will create a poem right before your eyes. I'm going to take a paragraph to work on, a prose paragraph from this book, The Trials of Thomas Morton by Peter C. Mankell. Due diligence and full disclosure, I have never met Professor Peter, who wrote this book. I have met his daughter, and thank you, Sophie, for sending it to me. It was a tremendous read. So I chose this paragraph because here we have a historian at the top of his game who's putting together quite elegant prose work. Embedded within it are some poetic elements, and they're usually connected to the emotional side of what's being written. But as a clear prose writing historian dealing with a very complex subject like contingency and the effect of contingency or the possibility of it within a historical narrative, to drive different kinds of narratives. What if things had turned out this way instead of that way, which is what this book is about. When you're doing that, you're trying to be very precise. So I've chosen that paragraph as a cold paragraph written by a very good historian. Okay, I'm going to take us over to the screen right now and we'll have a look at this. The paragraph that I've chosen, it reads like this. I'm going to read it out. I'll read this out to you and then take you through the steps of what we do when we break this up. Okay. Here was a place of suffering. By likening the unburied victims of this unknown plague to Calvary, Morton did not isolate the natives, capital N, in their misery. Instead, this tragedy marked a shared moment in the painful human past, just as Christ's crucifixion has symbolized a universal agony. Unlike his contemporaries, Morton saw the devastation for what it was, a sign not of the impending victory of the invaders, but instead the cruel marker of a world being destroyed. Little could he have known that, just as his book was being published, another event would alter the fate of southern New England. Now, the last paragraph in that, I'm leaving it out, because the last sentence within this, because that's an expository sentence leading us to turn the page and see what happens and so on. Pretty well written. So let's break it up now. Let's do the process. So we split this up. Firstly, the very first thing to do with your prose work, when you're going to look at prose into poetry, is take it, if it's already justified text, center it. Straight away you'll start to see some wavy lines on the outside, and it starts to more resemble, even though it's still a prose paragraph, it starts to resemble a poem in its physical structure. So center the text and then split up the sentences. First one, here was a place of suffering. Second sentence, by likening the unburied victims of this unknown plague to Calvary, Morton did not isolate the natives, capital N, in their misery. So we go on, each sentence is then separated. So what we do then is look at each sentence and think, what are the essential words here? The first sentence, I think we would leave it. Here was a place of suffering. I'm going to pull that out because I think that's a valuable sentence here. We have by likening unburied victims. This is something that's pretty solid in here, and so on. Misery, etc. So we might take out unburied victims. We might take that from this sentence. This tragedy marked a shared moment in the painful human past. Universal agony. I think tragedy, shared moment, universal agony. These are things I'd pull out of that. So, okay, now we get, unlike his contemporaries, Morton saw the devastation for what it was, not a sign not of the impending victory of the invaders, but instead the cruel marker of a world being destroyed. For me, the essence of this, you can leave everything else out, and if you just say a cruel marker of a world being destroyed, you've pulled everyone into the absolute sense and essence of what that writer was trying to say in that sentence, with just those few words, if we look at it as poetry rather than prose. So I pull that out. So what we get then is here, a place of suffering, unburied victims, a tragedy marked, a shared moment, a universal agony, a cruel marker, a world being destroyed. So we look at that, and the last step you might take when you get that, already it starts to look like a poem, I think you'll agree. And the last step there is to prune it a little further, and that's where the real sense of what poetry is rather than prose starts to work, because a lot of the clear sense in the prose paragraph, a lot of that is going to dissolve away into the mystery of what poetry is, because poetry is more about what you suggest and than rather what you ingest. You are allowing a space with poetry for people to write their own narrative within that, but you're guiding them. And whereas in prose, you're writing the narrative and you want people to understand that point that you're trying to make. And there's the difference. And it starts to emerge in the pruning process. As you start cutting and taking away a word or two, you start to get into that magical area where it makes sense and still makes essential sense of the original paragraph, but it's a different world and it's a new world. So let's see what happens if we pull that down just a little bit more. We get here a place of suffering, a tragedy marked, a shared moment, a universal agony, a world destroyed. For me, this carries the essence of what it was that this writer was telling us in this beautifully written paragraph of prose, but it does it in a different way. It does it in the way of poetry, which is through elastic imagination that allows people to reach into places they didn't even know they had inside themselves, that allows them to go into thoughts and areas that maybe before they hadn't even realized were there. So there we have, I think, an example. If we look back at that first paragraph again, and we check this out, in this well-written paragraph, and we look at this in its structure, in its regimented, form of everything here, every sentence and everything fitting within justified page lines and so forth, we started to break it up into sections where it already, through centering the text, started to look more poetic in its structure. Then we pruned it and we ended up with this amount of material, and then we go a step further and take it into what maybe is that single irreducible, the point where if you take even out another little phrase or word, you're going to lose it. So you get to that point where you know you've reached the single irreducible statement that you wanted to make, or that the paragraph was trying to make. So there's a small example. You can do this yourself. You can take a paragraph from a magazine, from a newspaper, hardcore. You can take it from a science journal and try that and experiment with that and see how you do it. Break it up into sentences, center the text, and then pull words out and look at what you get from it and so on. In doing this, as an example, I'm not saying that everybody has to do it. This is for people who really want to try to experiment as a poet and who've never really written anything poetic before. They may have perhaps written some lyrics here or there. They may have written out a couplet here or there that they think that kind of works. But they want to get started. They want to do a full-fledged poem. Try this out. What this does, as you're creating these little poems from solid text and from cold text, is that it gives you a way of thinking. Before you know it, you'll think a thought in your mind about a certain thing, and it's structured like a sentence in your mind, and you'll start breaking it up into just the essential bit from that. And then you'll go, that's it. And when that starts to happen, you're starting to think poetically. You're already starting to think within that pruning cycle, where a lot of things that are not required for the essential emotional message that you're transmitting, a lot of that starts to fall away. So there's a small example. I hope that helps you. And keep going, keep writing, never ever give up. If writing is your thing, I promise you it's not going to be the most rewarding job that you can do. Probably most writers could do really well on Wall Street because they're pretty smart people. But they prefer to write books, and they're not going to make all that much from it, most of us, but never give up, because without the written word on the page, what are we? Where are we? That is our way, our cultural way to transmit. And even if those words are digital words transmitted across a digital space, they're words. They're created by writers. So never give up, keep writing. Love and blessings, GDR out from beautiful Jamaica. One love.